Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, picture this. It's 1914, and Europe isn't a continent of peace. It is a heavily armed powder keg, literally just waiting to explode. You've got these powerful, industrialized nations aggressively building up massive armies, churning out incredibly advanced weapons, and locking themselves into rigid military alliances. The tension in the air was palpable, but really, no one truly grasped the scale of the absolute devastation that was looming just over the horizon.
So here's one of the most astonishing questions in modern history. How does a single, isolated event, the murder of one man, rapidly plunge the entire world into an unprecedented catastrophe, a war that would claim millions of lives? Today, we're going to unpack exactly how that happened. We'll be looking at the big-picture geopolitics, the terrifying new technologies, and of course, the grim, very human reality of the battlefields.
All right, let's dive into this. Here is our structural roadmap for today. A European powder keg, the spark that ignited war. Life in the trenches, terrifying modern weapons, tipping the global scale, and finally, the devastating aftermath.
Section 1. A European powder keg. To understand the explosion, we really have to look at the explosives. Long before a single shot was fired, Europe was fundamentally divided by deep-seated tension and mutual distrust.
Europe was basically split into two massive opposing alliance blocks, totally primed for disaster. On one side, you had Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And right across the aisle stood Britain, France, and Russia. Because of these alliances, if any two nations got into a fight, they were basically guaranteed to drag their allies in with them. It was a diplomatic house of cards, and all it needed was a slight breeze to knock the whole thing down.
Section 2. The spark that ignited war. And unfortunately, that breeze arrived in the summer of 1914. Let's look at the specific, shocking catalyst that finally set this powder keg off.
Let's walk through this domino effect because it happened incredibly fast. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo. During that visit, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated both the Archduke and his wife. The shockwaves were immediate. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia and, just weeks later, declares war. Because of that rigid alliance system we just talked about, the dominoes fell fast. Germany moves to support Austria-Hungary, planning a quick defeat of France by marching right through neutral Belgium. But invading a neutral country really angered Britain, which immediately declared war on Germany. Literally within a matter of weeks, Europe completely unraveled.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. The conflict was no longer localized. Russia mobilized its massive army against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And pretty soon, the fighting breached the borders of Europe entirely, spreading deeply into Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, as these empires called upon their colonial territories. A regional dispute in the Balkans had rapidly metastasized into a true world war.
Section 3. Life in the trenches. But geopolitics only tells half the story, right? Let's zoom in from that macro scale, moving away from those distant, grand decisions being made by government leaders dining comfortably in their palaces, down into the horrifying personal reality of the frontline soldiers.
I want you to try and imagine a young soldier sitting in a narrow, freezing, muddy dugout, trying to write a letter home to his mother. "Dear Mother," he writes, the days blend together in a terrifying routine. He described the dreaded morning stand to before dawn, standing shoulder to shoulder in the biting cold, rifles raised, just waiting tensely for an enemy attack. He'd tell her about the miserable living conditions, gnawing on hard, tasteless biscuits and scraping out cans of salty bully beef, often eaten right alongside enormous rats that scurried over their boots in the pitch dark. Millions of men were trapped in these long trenches, basically living in a continuous state of misery. They were knee-deep in clinging mud, battling the rampant spread of disease, and enduring the absolutely deafening roar of constant enemy artillery. And the crazy part? Sometimes they spent months without the front line moving even a single inch.
And the chilling reality is that many died without ever seeing the enemy face to face. Unlike the wars of the past, which were characterized by cavalry charges and hand-to-hand combat, this war was deeply, terrifyingly impersonal. That soldier writing his letter home could be killed in a split second by an artillery shell fired by an unseen enemy miles away. It was an industrialized way to die.
Section 4. Terrifying modern weapons. That impersonal death was driven entirely by a rapid leap in military technology. Let's shift over to the advancements that made those muddy trench conditions even more intensely lethal.
The Industrial Revolution had officially met the battlefield.
For the first time in history on a mass scale, nations were deploying utterly devastating new tools. Armored tanks rolling straight over trenches, military aircraft taking the fight to the skies, submarines hunting silently beneath the ocean waves, and perhaps most terrifying of all, poison gas.
Going back to that frontline soldier riding home, the absolute most paralyzing fear wasn't necessarily a bullet. It was the sudden panic yell of gas. It shattered their daily routine in an instant, as men scrambled frantically for their masks. Poison gas caused catastrophic human suffering, permanent blindness, severe respiratory injuries, and agonizingly painful deaths. It drastically escalated the destructive power of war, proving to the world that modern technology, when used for destruction, recognized absolutely no boundaries of human suffering.
Section 5. Tipping the global scale. So for years, this brutal trench warfare just resulted in a bloody stalemate. Let's move the narrative forward to see how the balance of power finally began to shift.
Now, at the start of the conflict, the United States firmly remained neutral. But Germany's aggressive use of those new submarines to sink ships in the Atlantic Ocean really became a breaking point. Tensions boiled over, and the U.S. officially enters the war in 1917. Suddenly, you have this massive influx of fresh American troops, vast resources, and deep financial support flooding into Europe. It completely changed the balance of the war and heavily strengthened the Allied powers.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the trenches, the situation was collapsing. By 1918, Germany was utterly exhausted. Crippling food shortages were starving the home front, severe economic problems had paralyzed their industry, and the sheer toll of 4 years of relentless fighting had severely weakened the entire country. The German forces simply could no longer sustain the war machine.
And so, after 4 agonizing years of unprecedented bloodshed, the guns finally fell silent. On November 11, 1918, an armistice agreement was signed. The fighting came to a halt.
Section 6. The devastating aftermath. But, as you can imagine, silence on the battlefield did not mean a return to normal. Let's zoom back out to examine the staggering global consequences of this conflict. The world as it was known in 1914 was gone forever.
I want you to just look at this number. 16 million. That is the estimated number of lives completely wiped out by this war. Millions of families spanning the globe were left grieving for sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. Entire cities and historical villages were reduced to ash and rubble. And the human cost definitely didn't stop at the death toll. More than 20 million additional people were wounded. Many of those who survived the trenches and the poison gas returned home with deep physical and psychological scars that would remain with them and their societies for generations.
This conflict completely reshaped the global map, literally erasing empires from the earth. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, 4 massive, historic pillars of global power, all totally collapsed as a direct result of the war. Global history was fundamentally rewritten.
In the wake of their defeat, Germany was forced by the victorious Allied powers to accept incredibly harsh penalties and massive financial reparations. The economic hardship, the national humiliation, and the deep anger that followed were profound.
Which leads us to a really haunting question. Did the harsh penalties of World War I essentially make World War II inevitable? What began with the assassination of a single man grew into a tragedy that claimed millions of lives and destroyed empires. But in the bitter ashes of that supposed peace, the seeds of an even darker future were already being sown. It really leaves us to wonder, when the guns of the First World War finally stopped, was the world truly at peace or just taking a breath before the next catastrophe? Thank you for exploring this vital piece of history with me today.